So now I'd like to welcome Provost John Ballin, who has expertise in restoration ecology and established the award-winning Natural Resources Conservation Academy focused on conservation and land use planning education for high school students, to make remarks about our Salon, protecting Acadia National Park through public-private partnerships.
Thank you, Daisy. Appreciate that. And thank you all. Oh, I got them over here. Is that right? I want to thank our speakers. I'm not the one that's going to introduce you, but thank you for coming today. I think we'll have some people online as well, and you'll be monitoring questions as they come in, right? Great. And so I love this topic, the private-public partnership. I think a lot of people don't realize how far back it actually goes in the conservation movement. It goes back over 100 years, right? It really helped start the conservation movement. In my own life and experiences, so as some of you know, I worked in the Everglades, the Florida Everglades, for a very long time. The last bill that President Clinton signed in 2000 was the Water Resource Development Act, which authorized a comprehensive Everglades restoration plan, which is a 30-year, at that time $8 billion, now it's like close to $20 billion restoration project that that got authorized. The interesting thing about it, it's a private, well, the private-public partnership is what really got it going. So Marjorie Stoneman Douglas wrote The River of Grass. She lived to like 108. She was a powerhouse, but she founded the Friends of the Everglades, and that's how it started. And could have a whole lecture just on that, and it's an interesting one. But it was interesting with that the private-public partnership that really got eventually the policymakers to put this forward, and it's a really unique unique partnership that really got it to be able to go forward. I will say, and personally, my own spouse in 2000 worked on a land referendum where the county would agree to essentially bond themselves, tax themselves to buy natural lands. And so this was actually in Florida in Broward County. You may know about Broward County and Palm Beach County during the year 2000 and the elections and what was going on then. But one good thing that came out, and I'm not talking about the outcome of the election, I'm talking about all the issues with the election that was going on that year, is that she was able to convince the Broward County taxpayers to tax themselves, 76% of the voters, $200 million. It was the largest ever bond referendum at a county level to buy the last of the national lands between the Atlantic Ocean and the Everglades, what was remaining of the Everglades proper. And she had great support from the Trust of Public Lands and the Nature Conservancy. It was a private-public partnership that really allowed that to pass and convince the voters that this was important. This is something that we should be doing. So these roots of conservation, you can go deep, in so many different places. But I promised Daisy I'd be short, but I'm the master of Daisy. so I will finish there. But I do want to thank all of you again for coming tonight. It's going to be a great conversation. Oh, and I can introduce Dr. Jeff Mills, who is the president and CEO of the Maine Foundation. Jeff got his PhD at Arizona State University, but he came back to his alma mater, where he got his undergraduate degree in 2012 to assume this role. And so I'll turn it over to Jeff.
All right. Thank you, John. So great to be here on such a beautiful night at the state's largest library and also the state's research library. So we're very pleased to be here at the Land Grant, Sea Grant, Space Grant, University of Maine. And I have the pleasure of introducing the panel that will be with us tonight. So if we'll start off with over to my right is Kevin Schneider. He is the superintendent right over here. Why don't you wave to everybody as there we go. He is the superintendent of Acadia National Park in the St. Croix Island. We're also very fortunate to have right here on my left, Dr. John Daigle, who is the associate professor for forest management here at the University of Maine. He's also a tribal member of the Penobscot Nation. And also, we're very pleased to have with us our alumnus guest today, who is Ken Olson. He is a black bear from the class of 1968. He also was a soccer player while he was here at the University of Maine and a member of Phi Eta fraternity. He also is a senior scholar here at the University of Maine. He's a member of two of our most distinguished societies for giving here at the University of Maine, the President's Club for annual donations that are given, and also the Stillwater Society. He is a second level member of that, which are the people who have given over $100,000 to the institution. We are also very fortunate that he has given his conservation papers. Those have been donated to the special collections right here at Fogler Library at the University of Maine. So we'll have you all take it away for our exciting discussion for tonight. Thank you all. You want them with the microphone or? Here.
All set. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. And I am really excited about the conversation tonight. I think it's a great honor, actually, to have this event. It's going to be recorded and be available for others to view in the future, which I think will be helpful to students here at the University of Maine and the public interest in learning more about Acadia National Park and its management. And so the format for tonight, we talked about, basically, I'm going to help facilitate some of the discussion this evening. I have a few kind of questions I'll be asking our guests, and Herb will be a moderator for the Zoom participants. And after we have a short discussion here, or maybe 30 minutes, we definitely want to open it up and have questions from the audience, both those that are in attendance here tonight and those that are on the Zoom link. So Herb will help facilitate those questions on that side. So yeah, so in terms of thinking about kind of starting this off, I thought it would be good to just kind of each of us share some of our personal experiences of Acadia National Park. Kind of can be shared personal experiences that you've had prior maybe to your position, your current position, past position. But eventually, how did that come to where you are now and your relationship to Acadia National Park? So, Kevin, do you want to start off on that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John. And thanks to the University of Maine for having us here. It's great to be here on a college campus. I love being on college campuses. So thanks for having me here. I fell in love with the national parks really when I was in junior high or high school. And I was fortunate enough to come to Acadia National Park, and my first job for the Park Service was working in public affairs in our Washington headquarters. And I got to meet Ken Olson at the time, who was the president and CEO of Friends of Acadia, when we were launching the Island Explorer buses, and when we were endowing the park's trails. And I came up to help with this event and fell in love with Acadia then. And my Park Service career took me to Yellowstone National Park, took me out west, and I met a woman in Ireland who happened to be from Maine and was a graduate for her bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Maine. So while I'm not alumni, at least my spouse is. And I said to her at the time, there's only one national park in Maine, which at the time was true. We didn't have Katahdin Woods and Waters then. And I said, might not wind up there. And here we are now. I've been at Acadia as a superintendent for almost 8 years, and it's a wonderful place to live and work.
Thanks. Ken.
Well, even though I was here at Orno for 4 years, thank you for having us. Thank you, Jeff, for your introduction too. And Stacy, thank you for doing this. John, thank you. And Joyce, you started it all. I got everybody. What a room full of luminaries. You're kind of on thin ice when you start introducing people. I guess somebody. Even though I was here for 4 years, I really didn't get down to Acadia very much. And my inclinations were more toward the White Mountains of New Hampshire, where I worked as a kid. All 4 summers that I was here at Orno, I worked as a hutman in the Appalachian Mountain Club. And I had been introduced to the mountains and the outdoors by my grandfather, who graduated from Dartmouth in 1917 and took me under his wing as one of his 6 grandkids. And that led to just a deep interest in the outdoors, eventually sort of professional inclination. And before coming to Friends of Acadia as president, I got to work for the Nature Conservancy in Connecticut as director there, and president of American Rivers in Washington. By the way, how many of you have heard of the Nature Conservancy? Yeah, everybody had. There were times this is the eighties, there were times when, we would get mail addressed to the Natural Conservatory. We got some stuff addressed to the mature conversationalist. There's nobody in my office. And we got stuff to the name I like best, the Nature Conspiracy. Anyhow, those all led to more and more to getting deeply involved, and a job came open here with a friends group, and I didn't know what a friends group was at the time I took the job. And did it for a little over 10 years and was deeply engaged in partnerships with the National Park Service, and very fruitful partnership, I think, from both sides. And we're not the only one, I have to say, that Friends of Acadia is not the only partner that does nonprofit work on behalf of Acadia National Park. There are many others. Ours happens to be raising private funds for the park that supplement and don't replace federal funding. We try to add a margin of excellence that cannot be achieved unless we're somehow involved in the equation. We also have a volunteer corps, and we do a policy on behalf of the park. We will lobby on behalf of the park. We're the only friends group in the United States that has a conservation director. Most of them have something called a program director, but we've oriented directly to the mission of the Park Service, which deals with cultural and natural preservation. That's what we do too. And there are 400 units plus now in the park system. Not all of them called national parks, and only 200 friends groups. So the job is big. And I'll finish with this: that I think the time has come in the evolution of the national parks, which started in 1892 or so, and were formalized in 1916, that the best parks have friends groups that are very active and successful. The parks that don't have active and successful young groups, friends groups, don't do as well generally, even in their own funding, not just what can be brought supplementarily. That's a thought I have in hand. I don't know how you think about that.
I think that friends groups undoubtedly bring a huge margin of excellence to our national parks. They help push us. I like to say, they help us be more creative and innovative. Because if I have an idea, I can go to Friends of Acadia and say, here's an idea, and let's see if we can find a way to maybe put a seed to this and give it a try, to pilot something. And piloting things, that's sort of like a code word for saying, hey, we're going to try something. Everyone doesn't have to get too excited about it, but we're just going to try it and see how it works. And that's where friends groups can really come in and help us. No doubt.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm looking forward to explore this a little bit more too. And I guess I'd just like to share a little bit of my connection with Acadia. Again, as mentioned, I'm from Maine, citizen member of the Penobscot Nation, and spent a lot of time doing outdoor activities growing up. And some of my earliest memories actually is going to Acadia, digging clams, and going to places near Acadia National Park. And that really kind of led to my love for the outdoors and kind of outdoor careers. So I went to the University of Maine and graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Parks, Recreation, and Tourism. And what was really valuable going to school here in Orono was the ability to go to Acadia. I worked seasonally at Acadia while I was going to school here as a dispatcher. Then I worked at Seawall Campground, and then I worked as a law enforcement ranger, all at Acadia while I was undergrad here at the University of Maine. And really met some great mentors that prepared me to work out west, but eventually I found my way back to teaching the same program that I graduated from in 1998. And actually some of the same people were working at Acadia when I was working there seasonally. And anyways, and that really kind of connected me to some of the research needs, and also for me to kind of witness the partnerships role that Friends of Acadia had with Acadia National Park on some of the projects that I was involved with. And so really, it's really something special that I think we'll start to see as we kind of describe some of the partnerships and experiments in some cases that were done to kind of test new ideas. Because I really feel that Acadia National Park is really kind of a leader in some ways in terms of thinking through some of the visitor management strategies and with growing numbers of visitors. And not to be biased, being from Maine and working at Acadia, it's still one of my favorite national parks that I've worked in. So, but one of the things that I observed, as a ranger early on, parks are popular, lots of visitors, but really, it has really ramped up in terms of the popularity of our national parks and the visitation that our parks are getting. And so, again, one place that I thought we could talk about is, again, kind of visitor management, thinking about all the people that would like to come to Acadia National Park. And sometimes it can be pretty busy, and thinking through strategies and in keeping a park an enjoyable, positive experience. And maybe Kevin, you can talk about, again, kind of the mission of the park, kind of that dual mandate, and some of the challenges that's associated with kind of, providing that visitor enjoyment at our national parks when we have increasing numbers of visitors.
Yeah, John, there's a lot there in that question, and I got my bachelor's degree in the same program more or less as you did at Colorado State. So I have a love for visitor use management because that's sort of what I got my degree in. And our visitation at Acadia in about a 10-year time frame has increased by 70%, and that's pretty exponential. And at the same time, our budget has more or less stayed flat. And in fact, when you adjust for inflation, our budget's down about 17 or 18%. And so, managing this increasing volume of visitation, people want to come to the park. They want to have a great experience. They want to have a transformative, life-changing experience. Those are the kinds of experiences that Acadia offers. And yet our mission at the same time is to preserve these places unimpaired for future generations. And so, folks have thought of this as this dual mandate of doing both of these things, allowing for enjoyment, but preserving unimpaired. And really, we have interpreted that mission to say that preserving the parks unimpaired is first and foremost, because future generations won't be able to enjoy them if they're not unimpaired in the first place. Mm-hmm. And so really, we're sort of like, as a manager, you're sort of like a physician in the sense of do no harm. We want to make sure that we don't harm these places so that they can continue to be transformative and inspirational for the future. And that really sort of sets up like this question about how do you manage a place like Acadia in a context of a visitation that's increased by 70%, stakeholders that want many different things from the park, communities for whom the park is very, very important economically and socially. People move to Mount Desert Island to retire, to be able to hike in the park, to bike in the park. It's why I live on Mount Desert Island, so I can also be a visitor in the park. So it's a complicated environment.
Yeah, and Acadia is a porous park. It was the first park to be established on the eastern seaboard pretty much, and it was created out of private property, so it was a bunch of patches. And the effect of those patches lives on today. There are many, many entrances to the park, some formal, some informal, which adds to your problem of management. Also, just on the bigger issue you raise about parks beginning to be or are being overwhelmed, the population, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the population of the U.S. at the turn of this century, the 2021 that we're in, 21st century that we're in, was 300 million people. And right now, today, just 23 years after that, we're about 330 million people. The moderate projection that the Census Bureau has, like 2050, is 400 million. So that's a gain of 100 million in under 50 years. And so my sort of rhetorical question is, where are they going to go? If not only just living space and resources, things like that, but as people have an even greater desire and need to recreate, where do they go when things are so crowded as they are now?
It's supply and demand, right? And this is where a park like I think Todd Woods and Waters, like the demand for these outdoor recreational experiences is huge, especially with the growing population. The supply isn't necessarily changing. Maybe we're adding some parks and protected areas, and people want to have these recreational experiences. And I think it points to the notion of trying to conserve land for people to enjoy for the sake of climate change, to be able to have places that can help us with our resiliency. And adapt to a changing future, but clearly we need to protect these special places.
I want to correct something I said, John, earlier, and that is that it was 1872 that the first park was founded, not 1892. I apologize to the people at Yellowstone and Yosemite.
Yeah, and again, one of my first exposures, you know, in terms of the partnerships that I saw between Acadia National Park and Friends of Acadia was a project that was being proposed around the Island Explorer bus system. And at the time, it was there wasn't a lot of kind of bus transit systems in national parks like we see today. So Acadia was really kind of on the front edge, kind of thinking through ways of managing visitors. Instead of, again, we're talking about a pretty small park, right? Instead of building parking lots to take up that natural space, how can we kind of think through a system where we can get visitors to those locations? And, you know, even though, again, Acadia is kind of unique, right? It has lots of entry points. It has hotels and campgrounds that are in very close proximity to the park. And really what was so innovative, I thought, related to that bus system was integrating the community, where people would leave their cars parked where they're staying, if they're not staying in a national park campground, and they could pick up that bus there, go into Bar Harbor, and then use the bus to get into the park. And really, and I think it was the reason why Acadia was also kind of awarded a kind of field operational test site, looking at the technologies to see what can be done to encourage more use of buses and getting people out of their cars. Again, when we're talking about populations where they're not used to using public transit. And I think really some of the things that were done between Friends of Acadia and Acadia National Park is pretty innovative. And I wondered if you could just share some of that partnership that was formed around that.
And also want to acknowledge your own work in a pre-study of the idea of a bus system and your conclusion among many that it needed to be free in order to be successful. There was at the time before the Island Explorer bus system, which how many buses do we have now?
There are, I think, 35 or so buses in there.
35 buses, and it is the largest bus system in Maine when it's operating. It's bigger than Portland, bigger than Bangor. And it grew from two little jitney-like buses that were run by the nonprofit group, Downey's Transportation, which runs the bus system now. And they were running a couple of bus lines down from Ellsworth into the sort of central part of Bar Harbor hotel routes. And the then transportation planner, who has stuck with you for so long, Tom Crickler, his name is, and has done many other park transportation efforts, came into the office one day with the head of Downey's Transportation. Is a very taciturn fellow, didn't say very much, but Tom said, can Friends of Acadia come up with some money to pay for the $2 a head that we're charging on the present bus system, to see if we take the $2 off, whether ridership would be influenced. And I remember this now, it came out to about $6,000, and I had a little discretionary fund at the time and didn't have to go to the board for it. So sure, let's try it and see what happens. And it was a massive success. The ridership jumped really large. And then the next year, the number was $7,600 that was asked for. We had that, gave it, and it showed a jump again. So we're pretty well confirmed that it had to be free. It is today a fare free bus, but what's really paying for it are entry fees and things like that. And gifts, for example, from LL Bean. We went down with the Park Service to LL Bean, just get LL Bean to see if they would be interested. If you've been down to see the Island Explorer, you know it's got LL Bean's logo on the side, and asked them for $1.5 million. They gave us $1 million, and they've repeated that several times now. And they're just, so this is the private sector coming in to try to help with the margin of excellence. Beam got something out of it. It got its name on the bus, and it has done its own marketing research that's told them that it's in fact a real winner for them. We knew that anyhow, but they've proven it to themselves. So that's an example of where private enterprise can put a little risk money down and help a decision along that turns out to be a very good one on everyone's part.
That's great. And what I really liked about that partnership was kind of that community buy-in. Again, seeing more and more visitors, but then how do we have those visitors move around, thinking through, you know, getting them out of their cars, maybe less pollution on the island. So it's almost like a quality of life, even for residents on Mount Desert Island. And other visitors, right, in terms of less pollution, which the buses were helping to contribute.
Every full bus that you see, there are 30 plus riders on it, I guess, is according to the figures, 10 cars off the road. And if you think it's crowded now, imagine what it was or would have been or tried to be if those 10 cars on the road times all those buses times all those hours of operation were in effect. Len Bobichuk, who was the deputy superintendent at the time of the origination of the bus system, started a little thing that has continued. He talked about how many cars were removed the first year, and he talked about, if you imagine a car backed up on the top of Cadillac Mountain, bumper to bumper down the mountain, the number of cars that would have been on the road were backed up to Ellsworth. So that was about the first time. Now, the Friends of Acadia cites this every annual meeting. The traffic, the backed up traffic jam bumper to bumper goes down through Ellsworth, goes down Portland, goes down the east coast of the United States, goes around all the way to Texas, goes up to California, back over the few zigzags. That's really in cars, but the problem still is here. And you've been interested in part by this transportation plan, which is a serious effort.
Yeah, it has. And the buses, I just say too, we just piloted the first electric buses this past month. And so we had 2 different manufacturers bring their electric buses. We put them on Island Explorer routes. We tested them. They ran great. So, the buses were always propane fueled. We're now looking at making them electric. And looking at investing in electric infrastructure. So that's great. 600,000 passengers before the pandemic are the numbers for Island Explorer. That's a lot of cars off the road. And one of our challenges is drivers. If you know anyone who's a commercial driver and wants to come to Acadia for the summer, come work for Island Explorer because it's a great job. But we need drivers. Island Explorer would like to hire as many as 120 drivers. This year, they only had about 75. And that's been consistent for the last several years. So, these are challenges. We'd like to expand Island Explorer even, but we're really limited in our ability because of drivers. And Ken, you kind of led into the broader transportation plan, and I think that's one of the challenges is managing success. So when visitation goes from say 3 million, when you might have worked for Friends of Acadia, to 4 million, which is what it's been for the last couple of years, that's an incredible growth curve. And even at 3 million visits a year, the park was very busy and extremely crowded. And how do you manage that success? How do you go about visitor use management? I think there are a number of national parks that are thinking about this. It's not just Acadia. Other parks across the country are also thinking about it. And it's really, really important because we want people to have these high quality experiences. And that's where the park a few years ago did a comprehensive plan to look at transportation in Acadia, effectively a visitor use management plan. And you can see the impacts of that or some of the initial decisions with that with the Cadillac Mountain Reservation System. We launched that in 2020 as a pilot, odd year to pilot it because it was right in the pandemic. But that pilot was very successful. And then we continued it for the full season in 2021, 22, and 23. And really what that is about is trying to manage the number of spaces. We have parking spaces at Cadillac Mountain. And I like to tell people that you get a reservation for Cadillac, it's the one place in Acadia in July or August that I can promise you'll find a place to park. You can't say that about anywhere else. But if you have a reservation, you'll get it. And people have great experiences as a result of that.
And what were the shutdown times before you got to this plan? Describe those. So when you had to close it.
Oh, sure. Yeah. In 2018, I think we had about 80 times that we closed the road because of traffic. We literally would get 911 calls from people saying they were stuck in traffic on the summit of Cadillac Mountain. And so imagine if a ranger had to respond to an emergency at the summit of Cadillac. Imagine if someone needed an AED, for example. And that ranger is not able to get through 30 minutes of corked up traffic. And that's not the experience that people are coming to Acadia National Park to provide. And that's really where this notion of vehicle reservations comes in, is we have this asset of parking, and it's utilizing that available parking, but trying to manage it to sort of the turnover rate of that parking to the amount of cars that it can accommodate and not more.
And soon the return to the Island Explorer just for a moment. Soon the Acadia Gateway Center will be in fuller operation than it is now, and that's where the bus operations base out of. They used to be in Ellsworth, now they're based out of this spot halfway between Ellsworth and, well, more than halfway to the park. And the object there is to have day visitors primarily leave their cars and get on the buses there. We know that overnight visitors have their luggage and their, their swimsuits and their stuff on the top of the car and backpacks and all that. They can't just offload and go on a bus. But we think with the amount of day visitation that we can offload a bunch into this system and get them onto the buses before they get to the park and before they get to the island. So that's going to be interesting to watch.
It will, yeah, that'll open in 2025. Great partnership project with the state of Maine, with Friends of Acadia, with the Federal Transit Administration. Maine Office of Tourism is going to be there. An opportunity to also not just market Acadia, but a broader slice of the state as well. Go to the Gold Coast, go to these other locations too, that are also great to visit. And so that'll become sort of a welcome center, and then an opportunity for people to leave their cars behind there.
Speaking of that particular partnership, when the federal government was interested in having transportation experimentation done, this is in the Clinton era, I think. It was encouraged that parks get partnerships set up with signatories, and there were 22 signatories, Kevin. This is when Paul Hartel was superintendent. There were 22 signatories to the creation of that Island Explorer bus system. There are far fewer in it now, but it took those to launch it, and it brought the kind of federal money we hadn't really seen before, Acadia, this transit money and stuff like that, came in as a result. Friends of Acadia's role as a private individual entity, besides being a signatory to the agreement, was to get the private funding set up. And there's one more thing I wanted to mention. I'll think of it later. Sorry. Okay. Oh, I know what it was. We got the option on the property. We were able to go in and buy a piece of property for several $100,000 after negotiating an option that became this area. And I forget the acreage, but that was another role that we could play that you couldn't. It's now property owned by the state, but in partnership with the park.
Yeah, and again, related to the transportation, that the coordination, again, at the federal level, the state of Maine, Friends of Acadia, others, it's just really impressive. And even other businesses, right? Because Sugarloaf and other ski resort areas actually look to how the design of the On Explorer was being used and how they might implement
Really?
their work, yeah.
It's the Sugarloaf Explorer. They haven't borrowed the name.
Is it right?
Yeah. So I did want to touch on some of the other partnerships and commitments. I think Friends of Acadia has really kind of stepped up to the plate and helped work with, Acadia in terms of some of the trail endowment money for maintenance. Also just with support with, even with some of the research in terms of assessing the visitor experience, which I think is really vital when you have something new that's being proposed and developed. They've been involved in that, and also trying to understand kind of the diversity of new visitors who are coming. As we have more and more visitors, they tend to be more diverse visitors. And a few years ago, they helped look at new trends with electric bikes and how that might be managed in Acadia. So again, it's kind of that visitor management and working with new visitors. They have the stewardship program at Acadia for educating visitors about, trace. Just a lot of kind of cooperation there, if you can add a little bit to that.
Yeah, sure. So even the reservation system at Cadillac Mountain was something that couldn't have been done without the support of Friends of Acadia. So Friends of Acadia had a number of pieces that they helped with. For building a reservation system, we have to understand what's the turnover rate, what's the average length of stay, for example, at the summit of Cadillac Mountain. It's different than it might be at Jordan Pond or at Sand Beach. And so we needed to understand that. We needed to understand how people come throughout the day there, what their patterns of behavior are. And so FOA funded a visitor survey and then a model to develop essentially a visitor use model for the summit of Cadillac Mountain. So we could use that. So we knew how many reservations to sell at any given time of the day. What's your parking lot turnover? Or do you want to manage that parking lot to be, say, 90% full? So there's a handful of spaces, but it's not, we don't want to underfill it and leave, visitors unable to get up there. we also don't want to overfill it too. So where's that sweet spot? That was funded by FOA. As I mentioned, in 2020, we sort of built these homemade kiosks to validate reservations. It was all very homespun. But we realized, based on the success of that pilot for 3 weeks in 2020, that we needed to make roadway improvements, for example. We needed to bring electricity to the site. We needed to bring internet to the site, so that if you have your phone and you have your reservation, our rangers could validate, yeah, that you got a legitimate reservation. And so FOA was able to pay for the traffic, the study to look at how do we make the place safe for our folks to work. FOA was able to fund bringing high voltage electricity to the site so that we could light up our kiosks and bring the internet to the site. You know, and they did that in the federal government. You know, one of the joys of working in the federal government is that we like to take our time to do things, and even procurement. And so as we're trying to get this site set up, literally in that time between Memorial Day, when reservations first start, and when the snow melts in, say, April, you have a very limited window in which you can do road work there for us. And so FOA was able to fund that to make it happen like that and not have to go through our federal procurement process, which would have made it impossible to open by Memorial Day. And that's the kind of excellence that a partner can bring. You're so much more agile, you can do things without going through some of our processes.
Yeah, and one of the things that really, I was there for 10 years, and a lot of what Kevin is describing is stuff that's happened since then. And I've watched the organization become even, I think, more excellent. Friends of Acadia has just been great in partnerships. And I founded at about 4 million when I was there, and we got up to about 18 million. It's now around 60 million in assets, I think. I forgot to look at the annual report, but that's the ability of the organization to enact good. Fundraising enables us to enact good. We are philanthropists, and the word philanthropy comes from the words phil, which means love, and anthros, which means humankind. And we are helping humankind by giving money. And we're not afraid to raise money. It's certainly true of my successors. But I want to say that on the speed thing that you mentioned, the different speeds, one thing that I truly enjoyed about working for 10 years as CEO was the relationship with Park in regard to making the relative speeds work. Because a good nonprofit works at for-profit speed. The government works at government speed. So the object is to have an understanding of what your partner needs in terms of his speed requirements or slowdown. Yet you have to honor our side, because we have donors that want to see results, not, oh, it's going to happen 5 years from now. A good example of where the flexibility of the park was on you mentioned the trails program. After Friends of Acadia, before my time, created the carriage road endowments, we got quickly into something called Acadia Trails Forever, which created endowments for the trails. And we went to you had Jim McCasey for a while before he retired, a great engineer who ran a lot of the practical aspects of the park. And he said, well, we have this thing called the PMIS, the Project Management Information System. And if you want to help us out with trails, the trails are at number 40 on this list. And we logically have to go down from 1 to 40. And so we were able to strike a deal with Paul Martell, one of your predecessors, and Jim McCasey, that, well, what if you put it up to the top, and we came up with $9 million, and you came up with $4 million through the fee demonstration program, which you did. That enabled that the Park Service was super flexible, got trails right up at the top where they belonged, and the thing moved. The other thing that happened to trails that I think was really interesting was Jim is a very logical fellow and said that we have 111 miles, I think, of abandoned trail, but we've got 115 of extant trail. I may have the numbers wrong. The peak of trails in mileage was during the war, interestingly enough, during about 1945, 45, 44 in there. And he said, we've got these beat up, regular trails, so why should we put funds into abandoned trails? And we said, well, how about this? If you could do even, 10% of the abandoned trail mileage, 10% of your total mileage that you're going to work on a summer, if that could be the little that you did for abandoned trails, and then you could put 90% to the other trails that really, really need it, that would satisfy the big donors who came in. And we had a $5 million lead gift, and this was a family that had sort of met and courted the Acadia National Park. And the answer was yes, we can do that. So what we saw flexibility in what you were willing to do, and we were willing to go to the donors and explain that. So, and it's worked out well.
Absolutely. No, our Trails Endowment today is crucial. And we have, you know, one of the things the Trails Endowment does, and I've worked in Yellowstone National Park, I worked in Grand Teton Rock, I worked in the Trail Crew at Rocky Mountain National Park, and I'll say something about that in a minute. But what the private philanthropy has done is that Acadia has some of the most skilled trails folks that there are in the national park system. And it's because of a couple things. One is we have a stable funding source. We have an endowment. That's more stable than congressional funding, more stable than anything else. And so that means that they have year after year, they have projects and they have a job year after year. So we have year-round workforce for our trail crew. And then because of the endowment, our folks are able to not just take a trail and maintain it sort of fast and dirty and get it done so that it's durable and well maintained, but they're actually even able to maintain it to a historical standard. You know, one of the things that makes Acadia special is many of our trails are historic. In fact, we're the only national park with the entire trail system listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So our trail crew will go and figure out, you know, how was that stream crossed in 1916? And they'll restore it to that standard. They'll go back and look at historic photographs and try to understand that, and they'll restore it to that standard. And that really is a much higher level of stewardship than most other parks can apply. And it's because of the Friends of Acadia Endowment for Trails. And the one other thing I wanted to say about trails is that, you know, if you're a student listening to this, my summer job in college was working on the trail crew at Rocky Mountain National Park. And if you like to hike, I'd say it's the best job there is in the National Park Service, because you get to hike with a chainsaw and a shovel. And anyway, it's a place where, you know, folks who are students, it's a great way to just be out there for the summer.
Yeah. Well, I want to leave time for questions, and maybe some students will have some questions for you. But I did want to cover one other area that really impressed me with the partnerships that I've learned over the years. And, you know, with the COVID-19 and the transition of how we teach and communicate with Zoom, and people were able to join our conversation tonight, it really kind of changed the landscape in our education system. And there's some negative, but I think there's also some positive in terms of who can participate, who can join, if you have internet. But it really expands the potential impact of you in Acadia National Park, because what really impresses me over these past few years is the educational program that within the interpretation staff, the Scoot Institute, reaching out to some of the communities in Maine, kind of doing remote education, still in person, but and all the national programming that they do now, talking about Acadia National Park in Maine and the ecosystems of Maine, so that people in the Midwest more and more. It really impressed me, and I know a lot of that educational program is supported with Friends of Acadia through staffing and funds and equipment. They have the green screen, like what other people have, where you have different backgrounds, and the outreach is impressive, and I'm sure that must impress some of the folks that belong to Friends of Acadia with just the different levels of public outreach that's kind of going on at Acadia National Park.
Yeah, and I think one of the hazards in this business is because you can attract some, being in Maine, on the Gold Coast of Maine, you can attract some really big funders. And one of the objects is, again, consistent with the park's mission and consistent with our ideals as philanthropists, is how do we have the ordinary American, right, or visitor of any kind, feel wanted and represented by, in this case, a friends organization. You have a democratic kind of mission yourself. Democracy is the parks, I think. You know, they really represent democracy. And we had to be very careful in some of our campaign structures to make sure that the person who gave $5 was as well appreciated as the couple that gave $5 million. And you learn to say thank you for all that, and having volunteers work too. One of our top volunteers came to me when we kind of were rumbling about doing this $13 million campaign on trails, and said, in the privacy of the office, I'm afraid that you're going to put us out of business as trail volunteers. I said, I don't think so. I think it's gonna increase your work and make it more important, which it has. It has. It's a big volunteer program now in conjunction with the park. Park volunteers come in, Acadia, Friends of Acadia pays for the people who run that part of it, in with the park's VIP person, visitor experience, was that?
Volunteer and Parks Coordinator.
Yeah.
VIP.
Yeah, so that's another partnership, but anyhow, it's for everybody. These parks are for everybody, and we have to orient our pitches that way too.
Very good. Yeah, did you want anything?
Well, just the education programs are phenomenal. We have, the Scudic Institute, which is our other nonprofit partner at Acadia National Park, operates the Scudic Institute campus. And they're really a research and education organization. So it's a great example how we have Friends of Acadia, which focuses on philanthropy, volunteerism, advocacy. Scudic Institute is really focused on education and research. And so it's a really nice complement. And we have this wonderful campus on the Scudic Institute where everything from kids, we have school groups there this week who are participating in an immersive outdoor education program called Scudic Education Adventure. Thanks to Friends of Acadia, thanks to LOB and other contributors to that, where they go out with park rangers into the intertidal area, they get their hands dirty and they, go find some sea stars or maybe some green crabs and measure green crabs. And, of course, they're a non-native species. And so just an incredible, and everything from that all the way to, cutting edge research occurring on climate change. There's a special on Maine PBS right now about soil to summits, where we're hiking soil up to the top of Sargent Mountain to restore the summit of Sargent Mountain in the park. That's through a scientist from Scudic Institute, also through support of Friends of Acadia. So it's really this web of partnerships that allows this stuff to grow fruit like this.
Yeah.
These are just some of the examples of the partnerships that I think make a really special relationship, things that really matter, where you can really see some positive effects of partnerships. And Acadia and Friends of Acadia, I think it's a real role model, I think, for other places in the United States in terms of that kind of relationship that can build. Is there anything else you want to share before we open it up for some questions?
Just to comment on that, we were talking earlier before the program started formally about, we have a nonprofit sector, we have a relationship with the park that is guided by a memorandum of agreement. I don't know what they're called now, but that's what they used to be called. And it's not a contract per se, but we agree to do this if you agree to do that. I call that the good fences makes good neighbors policy. It's kind of saying what we're supposed to do. But there are parks where the Friends operation and park operation are really at odds with each other. It's sad to see, but it's true. And you can lay the blame probably in both camps in each time. So it's not the paperwork that we have, the formal paperwork that makes the partnership. It's the mutual respect. It's the coincidence of mission, the deliberate coincidence of mission. It's appreciating what professionals are in both places. It's making sure that there's open communication. I remember when I was hired, one of the things that was talked about was communication. I said, Friends of Acadia should never criticize the Park Service in public. If we want to achieve something that's a little bit sensitive, it's to be done in camera. That's when you have disagreements and how you work them out. But the rest of it is respect, and I think that's why it works. Myself. It's all about relationships.
Well said.
Yeah. Oh, good. So why don't we, if there's a question, Herb, is there any question from our participants on the Zoom?
Yeah, we have a couple, two great questions, actually. I'll start with the first one. You touched on this briefly already, but Stephanie Clement says, I'm wondering how Kevin, Ken, and John think the nature of partnership has changed given COVID and the fact that so many of us are comfortable with online platforms. Should we be shifting park connection programs online, whether education programs, donor engagement programs, or student recruitment engagement? There's nothing comparable to having an experience in the park, but I'm interested in hearing your opinions on how things are shifted.
Well, you mentioned the green screen. FOA bought us a green screen. Thank you, Stephanie. And that has allowed us to take some of our education programs to schools around the country, even around the world. And bring Acadia to the classroom. Obviously, there is no replacement for being in the park, but having that ability to sort of broadcast virtually, the pandemic caused us to up our game very, very quickly. on this. You know, we weren't really that conversant in doing some of these programs online, but suddenly we had to, because that was the best way we could as classes were going remote. And so I think it's crucial. You know, when I worked at Grand Teton National Park had a great program that they did that was an online program called Snow Desk, where they built like the visitor center desk out of snow, and the rangers stood there and filmed to people around the world doing ranger-led programs through that snow desk. So I think the public expects it now for programs like this one, that you have an online component, and it does allow us to reach new audiences. You know, we know at Acadia National Park, we need to diversify our visitors, our workforce. It's really, really important to us. And so every little thing we can do, even if it's broadcasting online, that helps to get to that goal is really important.
Yeah, I think Stephanie has a good point too, in terms of thinking about future recruitment for employees interested in working for the National Park Service or other areas, because that is really kind of a need, isn't it, Kevin, in terms of building up. Here we have students coming, you know, they're getting their degree in parks, recreation, and tourism, but there's so many job offers. How do we entice them to work for Acadia National Park?
Yeah, we'd love to have them. We'd
Yeah.
love to have them.
And actually, you have quite a track record of sending people to us.
We do have some alumni there, yes.
Yes, you do. And some of them actually are students still too, or have been in the past, through what was then called the Bridge Runner program, and now it's called Summit Stewards. And a lot of people interested in natural resource management and are studying it come from Orono and spend the summer helping out down there and getting a really good professional experience and contacts. And sometimes full-time jobs can emanate from that.
You know, and one of the things I love about working for the National Park Service is you're contributing to something so much bigger than yourself. And you know, granted there are frustrations that come with working for the federal government, obviously, but the sense of mission and the esprit de corps within our workforce is so strong. And that's what keeps you coming back every day. And of course, getting to live in these beautiful places that everyone wants to go to on vacation is also really special too. But it's a great job. And you know, there are a lot of opportunities to come work for us, whether it's for a summer or for a year-round position. And if you Google Acadia National Park jobs, you can find our website and learn more about all the different kind of career fields that are out there. But we hire everything from, you said engineers, historians, archaeologists, park rangers. Most people think of it as park rangers, but it's so much more than that. To biologists, ecologists, laborers, commercial drivers that run our heavy equipment, carpenters, electricians, plumbers, you know, the list goes on. So it takes a village to make Acadia National Park run, and it really takes all the different skill sets and backgrounds and experiences.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Other question of her? Is there another one? Or?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, so an anonymous participant asked, do you think that the lack of people applying for the Open Island Explorer bus driver jobs relates to the lack of available affordable housing in the area?
Really big deal. Thank you for asking. Yes, I do. No doubt about it. If you don't have housing with your position, it's almost impossible to find housing in Mount Desert Island or even Ellsworth or Trenton. This is a big challenge for us. It's something we're actively working through public-private partnerships to solve. I'm really excited to say that this year, Friends of Acadia bought a bed and breakfast for Acadia National Park. And so that's 10 beds for our workforce, thanks to FOA in the town of Southwest Harbor. They didn't take any year-round housing off the market. This was a B&B. And so a very appropriate purchase, great location, that'll provide 10 beds. FOA is looking at building some additional housing near Jordan Pond on an in-holding that'll provide more beds. So we've realized that housing is actually one of the most important things we can do to be able to support our workforce. And you know, whether you're seasonal or even a permanent, you know, the cost of living here has really accelerated and at a pace that far exceeds the wage growth for our workforce. And so it's really important. It's also really important to diversity, equity, and inclusion, to making sure that if we want to be a diverse workplace and be an inclusive workplace, that we are able to offer housing to folks.
Good. Questions in the audience? No,
It sounds like you as superintendent have quite a bit of authority as far as what you can and cannot do in working with groups. Is that true? And has it always been that way? Has it been something that evolved? I was asking how much autonomy Kevin has with his position to be able to make decisions, or has it always been the way it is, or has it evolved a lot over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's an interesting one. I think, in general, one of the things that has made the National Park Service successful is that national park superintendents have had significant autonomy, operating within a set of comprehensive management policies and a set of guidelines. But, park superintendents have had the ability to work with their communities, work with their partners to kind of get business done. One of my leadership strategies is proceed until apprehended. And take risks, take calculated risks. And most of the time, you won't be apprehended, right? And so calculated risks. Obviously, we're not going to do anything that's really inappropriate, but I think that kind of I'd say aggressive kind of thinking is important in working with partners to be able to get stuff done. And Ken, I'm sure you have a perspective on this too.
Yeah, I've seen situations in which especially with the new superintendent, there is a sort of a tentativeness and a diffidence and stuff like that about decision making. And philanthropy doesn't skirt the edges. We're not doing anything wrong, but the farther away you get from a national park, the more you get into the regional offices and the national office, the less understanding there is of philanthropy, because fundraising viewed from Washington eyes is the dirty stuff we hear about every day in politics. So we've had a hard time, I think, except at the park level, explaining that what philanthropy is. It's a good thing that adds value to national parks. And it's not to be as regulated as I think it is. I think it's overregulated myself, but and it's because of this view that it's kind of the dirty money sense. They haven't matured about philanthropy down there, I don't think. Let's say it straight. Yeah.
Other questions? Did you have a question? I think a question on the Zoom.
There is, but if you want to go.
Oh, yes.
You mentioned a number of my name is Paige, and you mentioned a number of challenges and opportunities. I was wondering if you could paint a picture of Acadia 5 and 10 years from now.
Well, yeah, great question. I think, clearly the most important long-term challenge that we're facing is climate change. Climate change has the potential, or will, dramatically change how we think about Acadia. So in a 5 or 10 years time span, if we were to rewind 5 or 10 years, I would have thought climate change was something that was going to happen in the future somewhere, maybe after I'm retired. And I was wrong. Climate change is we're seeing now. And so we're seeing, as everyone I think knows in this room, events that are weather events that are not within sort of the historic norm. And so 5 or 10 years from now, we're going to see more of those. 5 or 10 years from now, our visitation may be 4.5 million. And so that's really where this transportation plan is trying to set us up to think about how do we sort of grapple with that growth. We're looking at having a vehicle reservation system for Jordan Pond, another place that's overly congested where you can't find a place to park. Today, there was literally cars blocking the parking lot to Jordan Pond parked illegally that had to be towed. That's not the kind of experience we want to provide for. And so other places like even Ocean Drive, potentially a vehicle reservation system for Ocean Drive in the park to manage to this capacity of available parking that we have. I think I hope we have autonomous buses in 10 years, and that'll help with that driver problem perhaps. That's really exciting to think about. I hope they're electric and carbon neutral. I hope we have solar on our facilities in 10 years so that the park's operations are carbon neutral. I hope we have housing for all of our seasonal workforce and much of our permanent workforce in that time span.
Yeah, with the hope that again, keeping those high quality visitor experiences, because one thing, when I was a ranger working so many years ago there, and when I'm there now doing research, and it's undeniable just that what an environment it is to be in. Just when you're encountering some, you get a wave or hi, you know, it's just a positive environment to be in when you're in a national park and when you're interacting with other visitors. People are in a good mood.
Yeah.
And so it's just a nice place to, it's a nice place to work. Besides recreate.
I think Herb had a question.
Yeah, so we did have another question. Oh, man, we have a couple great ones. So the first question is, what is the number one challenge at Acadia today? We might have just answered this to some effect, and how can partners help? And then we have another one queued up.
Yeah, so the challenge we're facing, like right in front of us, is really housing. And so, you know, we had a summer workforce of about 115, and yet we needed a workforce of 175 in the summer. So we were short, you know, some 55, 60 positions this summer at Acadia National Park. And that translates to trails that we're not able to maintain, carriage roads that we're not able to maintain as effectively. You know, all these sort of cascading effects, and that's really partly because of housing. And so we have on Mount Desert Island about 80 beds for our workforce. So you can very quickly see, you know, the math between 175 is what we need. We have 80 beds. We're only able to hire 115. Somehow we've got to address that. And you know, it is just not possible for someone to come work for us for the summer and not be able to have housing that we provide. We don't provide, you know, anything elaborate, but you know, people need a bed. And they need a roof over their house. And so that's where, working with Friends of Acadia, we're really trying to change those numbers, change those dynamics. And FOA is able to bring private dollars. FOA is able to be the accelerator pedal with buying, for example, the Kingsley Inn, the bed and breakfast, or helping to develop housing out of Park Inn holding. This is where these partnerships are really, really important.
Yeah, and then another question, Penelope Overton asks, can you talk about what Acadia's forests will look like in 2050 or 2100? Will the red spruce still be there? Are you engaging in assisted population range or species migration to keep the forest healthy in the future?
Great question. Yeah, that's a one that my colleagues at the park think a lot about. You know, 100 years from now, we know that Acadia's forests are going to look different. We think that there's of the 10 most populous tree species in Acadia, 7 are likely to decline. Red spruce could be one of them. If red spruce declines on the coast of Maine, it's going to look a lot different. You know, it's not going to look like what we think about the coast of Maine to look about like. And red spruce is by far the most dominant tree in Acadia National Park. So how do we think about this? I think this is philosophically one of the most interesting questions of our day. I got my degree from Colorado State University, which has a great natural resources rec and tourism program, in 1998. I'm not that old, not that long ago, right? And yet this wasn't something I was trained in as a student of how to think about climate change. We knew about climate change, but it was something out in the future. It wasn't something that I was academically being prepared to confront as a future manager. John, I'm sure your students talk about this all the time, and I'm sure it's something that you're thinking about now. But this is the really important question. And I know our provost has a background in restoration ecology. This is the future, is trying to figure out how do we restore these disturbed landscapes? How do we manage in the face of climate change? So assisted migration is something that we're thinking about. We're doing experiments, for example, with Schoodic Institute to understand, you know, what's the recruitment ability for different tree species? What are able to produce seeds and move to maturity? As we're starting to replant in certain areas, we're replanting with native species that we think are going to be more successful in our future climate scenarios. And so there's some really exciting science going on related to this at Acadia, and it's kind of fascinating to see, but it's also fascinating to think about philosophically, how do we manage in this? And my fear is that people like me who are superintendents are going to make mistakes. And if you're managing one of the crown jewel national parks like Acadia, you don't want to make mistakes, right? And so how do we learn really quickly? It's the importance of science, having really good research occurring in parks so that we don't make those mistakes and we really understand what we're doing. But also not doing anything is a decision too. And so we have to recognize that. and think about, not have our hands tied and be overly cautious either.
Mhm. Yeah, and also just, I guess, the way I kind of think about it too is just, how do we share that information, right? Things are gonna change. And we can be proactive, right, with looking at potential species that might be successful. But inevitable change is going to occur. How do we share that information for people to learn from? And I think with just the numbers of visitors and outreach education, I think it can help society understand some of the things that we're seeing now and that we're gonna see in the near term when we think about climate change. And plus, just with the visitor experience, right, we had the washout that took out Thunderbolt, which was millions of dollars to rebuild. And visitors could see that, you know, they saw the effects of that. And it's an opportunity actually just to kind of, I think, inform visitors of what we might be seeing more of in the future and how can we prepare for that. So related to the vegetation, but other things like infrastructure.
And science communication, I think doing that science communication is, as you said, is so important because we have such a captive audience. When they come to national parks, people want to learn, and it's an opportunity to talk to all of the American public and indeed people from around the world about what we're seeing. And so if you're in a place like Acadia or Glacier National Park in Montana, for example, you know, these climate change impacts are really right in front of you and clearly obvious. And so and we're a trusted brand. There's so many good reasons why we should be telling our visitors about the great science that's occurring in parks.
Any other questions? These are great questions. Thanks for the audience asking these questions for discussion.
I do have another one on
Okay.
Zoom, which is, this is an anonymous participant, with the increasing aging population, is ADA keeping up with needs? Are you providing virtual reality, using VR goggles programs at senior centers or other locations where folks are not able to get the experience firsthand?
Great question. Don't want to dominate all these, but, being accessible is really, really important. It's the law, it's the right thing to do. We have a project right now on the summit of Cadillac, you know, in the vein of public-private partnerships that's supported through Friends of Acadia to connect the parking lots on the summit of Cadillac Mountain with an accessible path, the what we used to call the Blue Hill lot and the main summit lot, because people use both those parking lots and they go between the various locations. We want to do it in a safe, accessible way, not have to walk on the road. We have an accessible horse-drawn carriage at Wildwood Stables for people who, you know, can't use a carriage. This is one that someone can roll a wheelchair into, for example, and be able to have, you know, the carriage ride experience through Wildwood Stables. But we have a lot more work to do. We have an accessibility study that Friends of Acadia funded that looked comprehensively at the park, everything from physical accessibility to even our website and how do we make our website accessible. So that is a very lifelong list, honestly, of priorities. But, you know, think about a place like Sand Beach. Sand Beach is totally inaccessible, yet it's one of the most important sites in Acadia from a visitor experience standpoint. And so, you know, that's a place where we just need to sort of blow up and rebuild that whole sort of parking infrastructure and physical infrastructure to make it accessible to people. And that's absolutely front and center on our minds.
And that fits really nice within linking with other systems like the Island Explorer that is ADA accessible, that can bring them to the Sand Beach parking lot and then maybe enhance that with other opportunities where they could go there. So,
Yeah.
and also with just understanding those visitor change dynamics, because again, what we were finding out with those using electric bikes was that they used to use regular bikes, but they're a little older now and they still like to ride a bike. And how can you work with that, you know, and which you are, you know, and so just kind of understanding those changing dynamics with our visitors is important.
Yes.
Are you using drone technology much with the park yet? And how do you balance that with the wilderness experience?
Yeah, great questions. The question was whether or not we're using drones to sort of, and how do you balance that with the wilderness experience? And it's a great question. Drones for use by visitors are not allowed in Acadia National Park or any of our national parks for those sort of wilderness kind of characteristics that, you know, you don't want to be hiking on the precipice and have a drone buzz past you. That's not the experience visitors are looking for. On the other hand, we are about to purchase our first drone for park administrative use. And we'll use it in sort of limited sparing kind of circumstances, but they do have the potential to really help us on things like search and rescue, potentially on fire, looking for, you know, if you've got a hot spot on a fire, things like a bridge inspection, you can send a drone up and take a look at something without having to put a human into potentially an unsafe situation and do it really quickly. So there's some sort of management interest for these. We've used drones to do well, we've used aviation to do LiDAR. University of Maine, I think, has done LiDAR flights for the park for research purposes. So, you know, there's some interesting things you can do, and we want to sort of start to put our toes into that water a little bit.
Good. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes,
another question.
yeah. Penelope just wanted to ask, additionally, could you talk about how the RAD philosophy is working out?
So RAD is resist, accept, and direct, and it is it's sort of a Park Service thought process on how do we manage in the face of climate change. And if you're thinking about climate change, you have a few choices. You can resist that change, you can try to accept the change, or you can direct it and try to shape it. And each of those pathways, and if you're really interested, there's a whole report that Nick Fisichella from the Schoodic Institute is actually one of the co-authors of on the Park Service's website. But each of those choices may be appropriate in different circumstances. There's no one right answer. John, you mentioned Thunder Hole and the cost for Thunder Hole, for example. Thunder Hole is the kind of place that I like to use as a great climate change example, because at some point, you know, the ocean comes in, and maybe every 100 years, the ocean resculpted Thunder Hole. Now with increasing storms, maybe it's every 20 years. Maybe in another 10 years, it's only going to be every 10-year interval or a 5-year interval. And at some point, repairing Thunder Hole is going to be a fool's errand. It's going to be more expensive than it's worth for the amount of time you're going to get out of that investment. And so what do you do about that? Do you direct change and tell people to go somewhere else that's more durable? Do you try to resist it by building a more sort of more bomb-proof Thunder Hole? Or do you accept it and instead walk away from Thunder Hole and say, you know what, we're not going to provide that experience there anymore for visitors? And yet Thunder Hole is a great one because it's, you know, national parks are often these places that have cultural importance to us in terms of generational kind of experiences, where maybe you brought your kids to Thunder Hole and now they're going to bring their kids, and this kind of get passed down through our American culture. It's part of Americana. And so saying we may not have Thunder Hole is sort of like saying, you know, we're in the Sistine Chapel down, you know, but what do you do about that? And what's the right answer? I don't know. I think these are some of the questions that are posed to us as managers because of climate change. But the RAD framework, resist, accept, and direct, gives us a way to think about this, sort of a cognitive framework.
Very good. Good. Yes.
And that leads me to a question I've been thinking about in social media and the kind of influencer experience and the folks wanting to go someplace and get that certain picture, get that certain experience with Thunder Hole. How are you kind of envisioning keeping up with that and managing that in the future as it increases park attendance?
Yeah, one of the things we've seen with social media is that these certain experiences go viral, you know, and suddenly everybody has to do it. And I sometimes roll my eyes at that, because I would encourage people to sort of buck the trend and find their own experience. You know, if you want to see the sunrise, there's places other than Cadillac Mountain, believe it or not, where the sun rises. And they're often just as good of an experience, or maybe even better. And you just got to seek it out a little bit and not try to follow what everyone else is doing. But, you know, I think national parks, and John, you may have seen this in some of your research around the world, have seen these places sort of go crazy with visitation when they're really not designed for that level of visitation. Maybe they don't have bathrooms, maybe they don't have the infrastructure. And because it's sort of gone viral on social media. These places have been altered or changed. And I think we want to prevent that.
Mhm. I definitely think it's gonna take some monitoring. That's gonna be required around social media to kind of catch some trends that might be happening that you can hopefully kind of respond to. But yeah, it can be, in some cases, a real challenge. Where you have unwanted effects. Based on these posts that just generate, oh, I gotta do that now, this person did this. Another person liked it, whatever, it just can build on itself very quickly. Yeah. I think the other thing that we can do is flip this on its head though, too, in terms of using maybe social media for other outreach efforts in response. So again, I think we need to work with it because it's a reality, right? It's a reality that social media, it's gonna be more and more of our presence. And how do we work with it?
Yeah, and I think embracing it and kind of jumping on it and getting in early and saying, this is so great, have you seen these other things too, instead of kind of saying, I think there's a way to work with that.
Yeah.
And I've seen some other park services really jump into those trends early and say, okay, we're seeing this thing starting to happen, let's jump in the crowd and jump on the hashtag.
Yeah.
And use this as a vehicle to get folks to see other places in our park instead of just this one viral moment. So I do think it can be done, but it's a lot of work.
Yeah, and I think there's a little tricky side to that too, and that is that places like Acadia, which is 36,000 of acres of fee-owned land, and maybe another 10,000 in easements.
A little bit more, yeah.
Yeah, so 48,000 acres altogether. Is a small park. It is the most heavily used park per acre, national park per acre in the whole system, and one of the smallest. And I think when you've got to still have a discovery factor. People can go in and accidentally or serendipitously find places, and you don't really want to direct people to those places. You want them to come upon them so they don't suffer the same fate. It's an interesting management balance.
That's right, yeah. And of course, I love reading, some of the superintendent's reports or the chief ranger report from 1950. And they talk about how Cadillac Mountain was overwhelmed with visitation, or Sand Beach was overwhelmed with visitation. And you could almost just change the year and not change anything else. And it would sound like it was totally relevant today. But my point is a little bit is that, our expectations have changed through time too. Where in 1950, what felt crowded to the employees at the time would probably not feel crowded to our employees today.
Yeah.
And so, we also change, and don't know if that's good or bad in some cases, right? But those expectations do change too.
Very good. Daisy. Yeah.
I don't have a question. I was just hoping that everyone could mingle a little, so if no one had any.
Yeah, well, sure, yeah, well, first of all, I just want to thank our guests for coming this evening and sharing this conversation tonight. In your time.
Can I just say one
Yeah.
more thing? I just have to say it to this group. How many have read Edward Abbey? Okay, some of you know Edward Abbey and his best book, in my opinion, Desert Solitaire. He was lecturing in Montana, a group about people like ourselves who care about the land and environment and like to act in it and take care of it. And he advised them this. He said, one paragraph of advice: do not burn yourselves out. Be as I am, a reluctant enthusiast, a part-time crusader, a half-hearted fanatic. Save the other half of yourselves and your lives for pleasure and adventure. It is not enough to fight for the land. It's even more important to enjoy it while you can, while it's still here. So get out there and hunt and fish and mess around with your friends, ramble out yonder and explore the forest, climb the mountains, bag the peaks, run the rivers, breathe deep of that yet sweet and lucid air. Sit quietly for a while and contemplate the precious stillness, that lovely, mysterious, and awesome space. Enjoy yourselves, keep your brain in your head firmly attached to the body, and the body active and alive. And I promise you this much. I promise you this one sweet victory. over our enemies, over those desk-bound men with their hearts in safe deposit boxes and their eyes hypnotized by desk calculators. I promise you this, you will outlive the bastards.
Oh, yeah, that's a great quote to end on. Yeah, thank you very much.